Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to go over the historical evidence for Jesus' ministry, crucifixion, resurrection, and divinity, and explain why I agree with the Christian account of Jesus' life and ministry. This is crucially important for me in my conversion, as I explained in my Why I'm a Christian video when I talked about the revelation of a personal God, and I think it's crucial to the Christian faith in general. If there's no resurrection, the Christian faith falls. And also, before I jump into this, as a quick disclaimer, I am not a historian. I apologize in advance to anyone who's coming to this channel and expecting some expert analysis on philosophy or history or something like that. The only things I really have credentials in are math and actuarial science. So beyond that, a lot of this is my own personal research and a lot of my own personal hobbies. However, I think because of how central the resurrection claim is to Christianity, I think that I, as well as all Christians, have a duty to themselves and to their own minds to analyze the historical evidence and come to their own justification for that belief, so as to not risk blind faith in Christianity. For a Christian historian with more credentials, I would highly recommend Wes Huff. I actually found his channel this weekend and have been looking into more of his stuff. Not as much of his videos or his points are going to make it into this video, but I found his channel to be really informative, at least as a start. Now, I'm sure some atheists right now are going to jump into the comment section and type up why they can reject Wes Huff out of hand without looking further into his content. I'm sure there's something. That's the problem with recommending somebody that I just found. But I don't know. From what I've seen so far, it seems good. But with that in mind, let's actually jump into the historical evidence. And here I just want to kind of give a brief summary of some things that we do know that I think are important. And to begin with, I think the primary and most extensive documentation that we have of Jesus' life and ministry and resurrection, crucifixion, all that, comes from the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and from Paul's letters. Paul's letters are more directed at like sending letters to specific churches, but I think there are facts that we can know from those letters as well, and there's some testimony of historical events in those letters as well. The Gospels are written about 30 to 70 years after the death from multiple authors, as I can get into later. There's evidence from like different styles, or they have access to different accounts. Additionally, and they're written by apostles like Matthew or John, or friends of apostles. So these are like first-hand, second-hand accounts, and they're based on these like oral traditions within Christian churches at the time, and potentially earlier sources. There's this common source that's referenced by Bible historians, referred to as Q, and it's like sort of referred to as the common base of information that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all drawing on. There's a lot of similarities in those Gospels, which is why they're grouped together as the Synoptic Gospels. John's a little bit different, but we might get into that more this video, but if not, it's a topic for another video. Additionally, Paul's letters are written 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death, and they, at some points, do describe Jesus' death and resurrection in a sort of creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Along with this, so the base of the evidence is Christian sources. We have a lot of Christian accounts of Jesus' ministry, his life, death, resurrection, all that stuff. Additionally, there's some non-Christian sources that describe Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, that being Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, and Tacitus, who is a Roman historian. They, at some points in their writings, describe Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and Josephus also talks about John the Baptist in his writings. Additionally, there is some archaeological evidence that we have, and some that is purported that we have. So, for example, there's the discovery of the Pilate Stone, which confirms the historical existence of Pontius Pilate. Additionally, the mother of Constantine, Helena, discovered what she claimed to be the true cross and what she claimed to be Jesus's tomb. It was at a site that was obscured by a temple built by Hadrian. It was a pagan temple that was kind of meant to hide the site from disruptive Christian religious practices. And using where he built that temple, Helena claimed that she was able to find the site of Jesus's cross and find his tomb and find all this stuff. And there's a lot of historical dispute about this archaeological finding, but I wanted to include it because I think it's something that people reference. Additionally, there's the Shroud of Turin, which is sort of a burial cloth of Jesus with a faint image of Christ. And I think this one is especially controversial, and we'll get into some of this later too, talking about what my views on some of the discoveries of Helena and the Shroud of Turin. But for now, I'll mention that those two are very controversial. Additionally, another evidence thing that we have from this time is the rapid growth of Christianity soon after Jesus' death. And this is accounted for by Tacitus again, and Pliny the Younger's, his letters to Emperor Trajan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing any of these names right. I really apologize in advance. I'm not a historian. And I've just read these names online. So with all that in mind, that's the last piece. We do have evidence of this rapid growth of this Christian movement after Jesus' death. So, along with this, let's talk about some of the limitations of this historical evidence, because obviously there are some. To begin with, outside of Christian writings, there are no eyewitness accounts, only brief mentions. There's no real eyewitness accounts apart from the Gospels. From a Christian worldview, this might make sense because assuming someone did witness the resurrection or did witness Jesus appearing to them after the resurrection, they would probably become Christian, but it also is a limitation on some of the credibility of these accounts. They do come with a bias. Additionally, the archaeological evidence is very minimal. I do trust the Pilate stone. I think that's credible evidence of Pontius Pilate, and I do think Pontius Pilate being backed up by Josephus and Tacitus, I do think the existence of Pontius Pilate is very well confirmed, and the Pilate stone helps make that more credible as well. And then I think with some of the discoveries of Helena, I haven't dug too deep in the controversy on this, but I do think there's good reason to be skeptical of some of this. It's possible she discovered the site, but some of the claims about we have parts of the true cross, or we know exactly where Jesus' tomb are, I'm a little bit more skeptical of these, and I would recommend doing more research into this. And the Shroud of Turin, from what I've seen, I think the Shroud of Turin is very likely a forgery, and you can do your own research on that. I just don't think that's real archaeological evidence. And as a result, basically the point here, one of the limitations is there's not a ton of archaeological evidence of Jesus' ministry, which in a way we would expect this because he was first century peasant. There's not a lot of information that we have about individual first century peasant class people. We have information about rulers like Caesar, but we don't have all this information about smaller peasant level people. Thus, because of this, I think the historical belief in the resurrection depends almost entirely on how much you trust the credibility of the gospel accounts and of Paul's letters. And I think in general, when we think about historical analysis, the credibility of testimony is central, because most of what we have when it comes to history is testimony of different things. It's rare that we have archaeological evidence backing up every single claim that we have in history. A lot of it comes from just things that people have written down, and we have to look into that, come up with certain historical principles that we can apply to gain knowledge from these things. But yeah, those are the limitations of this historical analysis. And a lot of these limitations lead a lot of skeptics and atheists to reject this historical evidence. So I don't want to just brush over this as if these are small things. These are big. issues. But next, with all of this in mind, with what we know, with what sources we do have, with what evidence we do have, and considering the limitations, there are a few things that we do have historical consensus on. And I find listening to people like Bart Ehrman to be very helpful here. I think he, while I disagree with him as he's not a Christian, I think he takes a rational historical approach to this, as opposed to other people who talk about the resurrection and the historical evidence. But I think first, historians generally tend to agree that Jesus existed. As a historical figure from that time period, Jesus is incredibly well documented. His biographies come very soon after his death relative to other historical figures and other biographies. And I think the historical standard of evidence that is applied to Jesus by some of those who don't believe that he even exists this standard would lead to disbelief in figures like Alexander the Great or Plato. Like, there is a lot of evidence that at the very least Jesus existed. Beyond that, that's where we can get into debates. That's where we can discuss further. That's where we can have a whole Christian, non-Christian debate. But before that, if someone is not even willing to admit that Jesus likely existed, I think that person is too far gone to be able to have a rational conversation with about the historical evidence here. Second, Josephus' documentation of John the Baptist, an agreement between multiple attestation from all the Gospels about his significance, 3 of them including the baptism, John not necessarily including the baptism, but including a lot of discussion of John the Baptist. This leads historians to generally believe that Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist was a real event. And then finally, the gospel documentation and external source attestation of people like Josephus and Tacitus of the crucifixion leads scholars to generally believe that the crucifixion was a real historical event as well. Additionally, there's a criterion of embarrassment, which supports both the baptism and crucifixion, as Christians would be unlikely to just invent a story that implies that Jesus was subservient to John the Baptist, or that involves the humiliating or painful death of their God on a cross. Okay, so with all of that in mind, now that we have a general starting point, like what is generally agreed upon by historians, now I want to go in and explain why I personally trust the Christian account. So, first, I want to say that I am philosophically predisposed on this topic to be skeptical. Resurrections, they're miraculous claims, and there's not a scientific way for people to resurrect. So my mind naturally jumps to doubt. I would generally doubt a resurrection claim. If you came to me tomorrow and said that your buddy Billy resurrected from the dead and here he is, look at this, I would demand a lot of evidence for that claim, and I'd be very skeptical. It's a big claim. I'll give that to all of the atheists and skeptics out there. So I very much empathize with the doubt. I was an atheist for all of my college year, for I think like 5 or 6 years. And I'm not that old. I'm almost 24 years old, so 6 years is a long time. But so yeah, I empathize with doubt and the need for extraordinary evidence. However, I don't think that we can write off an explanation before considering the evidence. Because at that point, you already have the conclusion in mind. You're not an evidence-seeking person if you just write off the evidence, jump to a certain conclusion because of some a priori rule that you have that supernatural claims are unjustifiable. And of all the historical supernatural claims, I think this claim of Jesus' resurrection appears to be one of the most well-documented, one of the most evidenced possible supernatural claims in history. And I think a lot of atheist scholars would agree with this as well. And then additionally, along with this, there's not any, well, I guess to finish up on the why it's one of the most well documented. There's 4 separate accounts. There's all these letters that happen very soon after the time of the death, all these attesting to the resurrection having occurred. I think of all supernatural claims, you'll struggle to find one that is that well attested, especially for the time period. But okay. Additionally, there is no evidence that directly contradicts Jesus' resurrection. I'm sure people have looked, and there's no documentation claiming that Jesus' grave was robbed. No one's been able to produce the body of Jesus, his remains. There's never any of this at any point in history. The tomb was empty. However, obviously, absence of evidence that contradicts it does not prove that there is no possible evidence. So, in a sense, Christianity is falsifiable. If you could find the remains of Jesus tomorrow, I would obviously have questions. I'd want to analyze that further. But if you could find the remains of Jesus tomorrow, then I would no longer be a Christian, because that would contradict the biblical account that says that Jesus resurrected and ascended into heaven. But with all of this in mind, I think let's actually jump into a few points about why I believe that these Christian accounts are credible. So to begin with, Paul's letters that were written 20 to 30 years after Christ's death, they attest to his resurrection and divinity in places like 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 2. Paul, at this time, he was in contact with the apostles. The apostles were first-hand accounts. They were first-hand witnesses claiming to have seen the resurrected Jesus after he resurrected. So this indicates that he did base these opinions on eyewitness testimony. He was in contact with the apostles. He had access to all of their first-hand accounts, and his teachings were based on that. He was writing these letters to different churches based on his conversations with the apostles and what he'd learned from them. This also attests to the fact that there are beliefs very early on in the Christian church among the apostles that Jesus resurrected and Jesus was divine. This is pointed to in Paul's letters. He points to the resurrection. He calls Jesus God. He refers to Jesus' divinity. And he also appeals to the existence of living witnesses, including a reference to like 500 witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, indicating that his claims, they could be verified or corrected if they're wrong by living eyewitnesses, like the apostles, for example, or these 500 witnesses. As a second point, the Gospels provide us with multiple accounts of the resurrection, while hinting at, in the case of John, or in the case of John, outright stating the divinity of Jesus. While later in Paul's letters, while the Gospels are later than Paul's letters, they're still early in the context of other historical biographies. These were written in general from 30 to 70 years after the death of Jesus, which is very, very soon after his death for a deep biography to be written, especially for someone at that time. Additionally, there's evidence that these Gospels were written by different authors. There were different facts included. There were different facts included in each of them. There's different styles, and all of these things indicate that there's stronger credibility. If not everybody has the same facts, they probably have some other source here that they're referencing, that they're building into it. And additionally, they all have a generally common narrative. And the fact that these all do come from different sources and generally point to a similar narrative provide multiple attestation of the fact that the general points that they have in common are true. Things like the crucifixion, things like the resurrection, but then also like the baptism, like all these different things happening throughout Jesus' life. Additionally, gospel details like Pontius Pilate, like Herod, like the temple in Jerusalem, they are confirmed by archaeological findings, which lends credibility to the fact that the people who wrote these were in this historical context. These are not like later forgeries by the Romans or later forgeries by the medieval period, because these people seemed intimately familiar with the context, as evidenced by, with the historical context, with the area, with everything going on at the time, as evidenced by some archaeological findings later down the road. Additionally, these early Christian authors who wrote the Gospels, they were motivated to preserve accurate accounts by living eyewitnesses who, if they were wrong, could discredit everything that they're saying. So they're motivated to at least preserve some level of historical accuracy because they're living with people who witnessed all of this stuff. There's people who could easily just come and say, no, you're wrong. This didn't happen like this. And given that two of them are eyewitnesses and the other two are friends of eyewitnesses, they would be able to be easily corrected by these eyewitnesses. Additionally, there were hostile Jewish and Roman authorities who were motivated to discredit these stories. If they found something that contradicted or didn't make sense, they could use that to discredit the stories of the Christians. And then as a third point, the eyewitnesses are credible and to be trusted. The apostles who claimed to see the resurrected Jesus faced a lot of persecution and martyrdom for their claims, yet they boldly affirmed Jesus' resurrection all the way to their graves. They were martyred for their belief, for their claim that they saw the resurrection of Jesus. You don't die for a lie like that. At some point, they're going to kill you. You're like, okay, fine, I was lying. It's fine. But there must be something deeper to that, or at least they're convinced that there's something deeper to that, because they wouldn't die for a lie. Nobody would do that. And it's especially true that it's a claim that they saw something, that they tangibly saw the resurrected Jesus. You wouldn't die for a lie of that type. But at the very least, I think they experienced something significant, and it shifted their behavior from being afraid of these Roman Jewish authorities before to afterward, after they see the risen Jesus, now they're out boldly proclaiming that they saw the resurrected Jesus. And I think this is expressed in their sincere belief. I think this demonstrates their sincere belief. And I think other explanations like group hallucinations are absurd. I don't think group hallucinations can happen at this scale. There's no medical documentation of this having ever happened. And like having a literal person appear to you, all of you see him. There's not really evidence of these type of group hallucinations. And claiming this is so unscientific that I would almost argue that that's a supernatural claim in itself, that a large group of people had these types of hallucinations. That almost seems supernatural from my perspective. Additionally, I think having them, or saying that they stole the body afterwards, somehow moving the gravestone out of the way, but saying that they stole the body or some other type of lie, like they're just lying, it fails to acknowledge the sincerity of their belief. They went to the grave with this. There's something deeper here. They were willing to die based on the claim that they were eyewitnesses of something, which is crazy. And there's so many of them. So if Christianity, I guess, fourth, the rapid growth of early Christianity is difficult to explain without at least some sort of origin story, without something having happened. And that's kind of the main point that I want to get at here. It's not that, it needs to be true because there's a movement around it. That could prove so many other things. Instead, it's that it shows that something happened. It shows that something happened that would have changed these people's minds. Because if Christianity was just invented without a real event, people who are naturally skeptical of these types of unfamiliar supernatural stories, they wouldn't be so quick to jump into this strange religion that depicts this crucified God, this very confusing and difficult to comprehend Trinity form of the God, a resurrection, all these different things, without something substantial. Like there would have to be something substantial, something important that happened, regardless of whether that's a resurrection or not. It's likely that something had to have happened after Jesus' death. because of just this large movement that came out of it afterwards. Something happened here. But thus, with all this in mind, I think that given that it's clear that Jesus was a real historical figure who taught, had apostles, was crucified, and given the fact that something happened that inspired this new conviction in these apostles and started inspiring the growth of all these churches, and the apostles taking this conviction with them to their death, I think that what happened, I think that this thing that happened is most reasonably to be assumed, or the most reasonable thing to assume that this thing that happened was, that this major event that happened, is the thing that is extensively documented and claimed by the eyewitnesses of whatever this thing is. I think the most reasonable conclusion is that the thing is a resurrection, because this is what all of the extensive documentation claims that were around this event, and this is what's claimed by the eyewitnesses. I think the most reasonable conclusion to draw from that is that the thing that happened is a resurrection. Okay, so with all this in mind, I want to lay out a few points for people who may still be on the fence after this, for people that aren't entirely believers, or people that aren't entirely skeptics. I don't think this type of analysis is going to convince the people who are all the way in the skeptical camp. And I don't think that this type of analysis would even be helpful for people that are already believing. But I think for people that are kind of sitting on the fence here, that aren't sure, I think there's a few points that I want to make here. To begin with, I want to introduce to you guys the statistical concepts of sensitivity and specificity. So let's imagine this grid here. Let's undo that. So what I'm doing here is I'm drawing out a grid of different types of beliefs and their reality in this situation. Okay. So with this in mind, what I'll explain here is the difference between specificity and sensitivity. So sensitivity is the likelihood of accepting a true belief if it's true. So if we analyze everything above this green line and look at the probability of all these things, of either one of these things, of the thing being true, given that it's actually true, of you believing that it's true, given that it's actually true. Let me explain here. Hold on. Actually, let me define it first. Sensitivity. Okay, that was a bad definition. Let's go into this. So sensitivity is the likelihood of accepting a true belief if it is true. So we take the instance of all possible of it being true, and it's the probability that you believe it if it's true. So over here you have it's actually true. If it's actually true, what's the probability that you believe it's true? The other concept is specificity. Let's actually scoot over here. So specificity is the concept that if a belief is false, what is the likelihood that you reject it? So given that it's actually false, what is the likelihood that your belief falls in here? So sensitivity is given that the actual belief is true, that your belief falls in here, that you believe that it's true correctly, basically. And specificity is the probability that you reject the belief given that it's false. At the end of the day, all of us want to be here or here. We want to accept true beliefs or we want to reject false beliefs. However, there is this inherent trade-off in your frameworks between high sensitivity and high specificity. If you become someone who is more skeptical of different claims, you'll be more likely to believe that claims are false, just in general, thinking in general here. So skepticism moves you along this axis, and in general, if you are more skeptical in general, you're more likely to reject things that are false, which is good, but you're also more likely to reject things that are true, which is not good. Here, let me actually draw it like this. I don't like that. That's a empty set. I'll do it like it's like blocked off, which is bad. However, if you're the type of person who is very willing to accept things and you're almost to a fault like unskeptical, very like gullible, then you move in this direction. So, although you become more likely to believe things that are true, you also become more likely to believe things that are false, which is bad. So there's this inherent trade-off here. Depending on which direction you move, there's some benefit that you get with rejecting false things, but also rejecting true things, versus if you move the other direction, you're more likely to accept false things, but you're also more likely to accept true things. You're more likely to accept things in general, depending on your disposition. So, basically, in a court of law, we tend to favor specificity over sensitivity. So what this means in the context of a court of law is that in a court of law, we basically favor specificity over sensitivity, which means that we require very strong evidence to convict someone, even if that means we let a few guilty people free. So the true belief here is that someone is guilty, or the actual true is that someone's guilty, and the belief that it's true leads to conviction, while belief that it's false leads to letting them go. Additionally, the actual that it's false is that the person's innocent, and if it's false but we believe it's true, we're going to convict an innocent person. And if it is false and we believe that their guiltyhood is false, then we're going to release the innocent person. So basically, in the context of a court of law, we favor the releasing of innocent people. We do not, this is bad. We do not want to, we don't want to convict innocent people. But, so we end up moving this way on the spectrum because we favor specificity. We're more skeptical that someone is innocent or someone is guilty. So we are also, as a result, more likely to release guilty people. And this is the trade-off that we accept in a court of law. This is just kind of the direction that we take here. So our goal in this context is to reject as many false beliefs as possible, even if it means that we may reject a true belief that someone is guilty in the process. This is how we think about it in a court of law. Okay, now with all of this aside, with all this concept aside, how does this apply to our historical evidence for Jesus? So, my claim here is I think that the over-skepticism of atheists regarding the claim of the resurrection overemphasizes specificity, similar to a court of law, oversensitivity, when it's not actually preferable to do so in this context. As a result, I think a framework of over-skepticism, one that moves this direction into being more likely to consider beliefs false, I think it leads the unsure to reject resurrection claims improperly. I think treating this issue like a court of law is improper because unlike the court of law, the consequences of failing to accept a true belief, the consequences right here, are far graver than failing to reject a false belief, which is believing in a false resurrection. So the basic idea here, in a court of law, this context right here is far worse than this context. But my claim in this sense is that this claim, or this example, the belief that something's false when it's true, in the context of the historical evidence for Jesus, this is far graver than this is. So our framework should not take the form of a court of law when we're analyzing and trying to understand whether or not to believe the historical evidence of Jesus. And my point is, if we fail to accept the true resurrection, so we believe that it's false, when in reality it's true, we risk an unhappy life. That's what I want to emphasize, actually, the fact that we do risk an unhappy life in this context. Because acceptance of the resurrection of Jesus implies certain beliefs about our nature and what we need to do to be happy in this life. It's not just for whatever afterlife punishment or reward that we get. I think a lot of people frame it through that lens, and I think that's a terrible misunderstanding of what Christianity is. So one thing is, if we fail to accept the true resurrection, the resurrection is true, and we don't accept it, we risk an unhappy life, and we risk eternal damnation. However, if the resurrection's false, and we decide to believe that it's true in that context, if we fail to reject the false resurrection, which is over here, we risk living a life with an arbitrary sense of meaning and wasting time on something that is ultimately meaningless outside of our own perspective. In other words, we're no worse off than this person, except this person is correct. In this context, I think it makes no sense to adopt this overly skeptical framework that it wants to put us in one of these two boxes, or that more bias us is toward one of these two boxes, believing something's false. I think it makes no sense to adopt this overly skeptical framework while approaching this issue. Instead, I think we should be a little bit more open to the evidence that we have. And this doesn't assume that the resurrection is true on this basis alone. If you're not convinced by the evidence for the resurrection, even if you have an open mind, don't believe it. I'm not here to convince you through the sensitivity, specificity dynamic that you should suddenly believe in the resurrection now, even though in your mind there's literally no evidence for it and all this evidence is terrible. But I think this framing, and it's from Pascal's wager, basically, for those of you unfamiliar with this whole way of thinking about this, I think this basis gives people that are on the fence, like I was, and not skeptics. I'm not talking to the people who aren't on the fence, that are convinced that there is no evidence. I think it gives people that are on the fence a reason to reevaluate their framework and be a little bit more open to this evidence rather than treating it like this court of law sort of issue. At the end of the day, I think there's very little that we know for certain in this context, and the truth of what happened in 33 AD to Jesus Christ of Nazareth and his apostles, I think it's certainly beyond our ability to have absolute certainty about. However, I think after a thorough examination of the evidence on my part, and I hope on your part as well, and evaluating my framework for evaluating the evidence, I believe that the historical account of Jesus' ministry, crucifixion, resurrection, and divinity, as explained by the Gospels and Paul's letters, I believe that that historical account is reliable, and as a result, I confess that Jesus is Lord, Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is God, and I believe that he resurrected. And with all of that in mind, I will open it up to the comment section. Per usual, I'm going to read every single comment underneath this video, and as much as I'd love to respond to everyone and give this full in-depth response and go on all these long comment section tirades with people, life is busy, and I find that social media and getting in these long comment disputes can be so distracting and just frustrating, and part of me would just rather focus on my work and focus on making these videos and doing more research and reading rather than engaging in all these long comment threads. The comments are helpful. Please give me your feedback. I'll read everything and I'll consider them in future videos. They make me smarter at the end of the day because it gives me an opportunity to consider what the opposition has to say to my opinions and to get feedback on my videos. So please keep the comments going. And I'll try to respond at least once if I have time to everybody. But I'm going to intentionally try to avoid these long comment disputes. If you want to talk, please feel free, reach out on Discord, and I can set up a chat, or we can have a textual back and forth on Discord. I'm fine with that. Or just we can call and have a one-on-one conversation. But yeah, so just reach out. We can have a one-on-one talk. I don't always like engaging in the comment sections. Sometimes things are weird and they hold back comments and it's weird. Let's just reach out. We don't have a talk. We'll reach out. We'll talk one-on-one. Finally, if you enjoy all of this content, please subscribe to get notified of these weekly uploads. I can finally feel comfortable promising weekly uploads at this point, given that I have been able to upload something every Monday for at least the past month. It's been pretty consistent lately, which is nice compared to my previous stint of going like 7 months or multiple years without posting anything. But yeah, I feel like I can start promising weekly uploads now, now that I've been more consistent. So yeah, please subscribe for those. But with all of that in mind, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.